They pushed the obese girl into the mine until the giant cowboy dragged her back to light. The clang of metal on stone echoed across the Brightwater mining yard as midday sun glared off iron tracks and dusted planks, turning every movement into a harsh silhouette, and in the middle of it all stood Mara Hale, round-faced, soft-bodied, breath trembling as a ring of miners jeered around her like wolves tasting weakness, their shadows long and predatory against the ground. She clutched a small cloth bundle to her chest, knuckles white, but one of the men snatched it away and tossed it aside before shoving her forward with the flat of a shovel so hard she stumbled to her knees. "Dead weight," he spat, tapping the shovel's metal edge against the dirt as if testing it against her dignity. "If she wants to eat from the company store, she better earn it." Laughter cracked through the yard like broken rock as the foreman, Harlan Pike, a thick-necked man with a rope burn tattooed into his wrist from some old cruelty, stepped forward with an oily grin, lifting the very same shovel and pointing it toward the yawning black entrance of the number 3 shaft. "Only one way to make her useful," he said loudly, making sure every man could hear. "Send her down where the real workers go." Mara shook her head, breath breaking, hands pressed against the gritty earth as she tried to rise, but Harlan planted a boot on her shoulder and pushed her sideways until her cheek hit the dirt, the hot ground burning against her skin. The crowd roared as he gripped the shovel like a judge's gavel, its shadow falling over her face, and Mara whispered, "Please, don't," her voice barely more than a cracked breath. But Harlan leaned in with the stink of whiskey on his breath and snarled, "When you weigh twice a worker, you work twice as hard." Then he jammed the shovel under her elbow, levered hard, and sent her tumbling toward the wooden lip of the shaft, so abruptly she screamed, her hands grasping at air as her legs slid over the edge, boots scraping wood, her body hanging half over the drop where only blackness waited. And that was the moment the entire yard went silent, not because of pity, not because of guilt, but because a shadow larger than any man there fell across them, blocking the sun like a mountain shifting into place. Jonah Creed stood at the yard's edge, broad as a barn door, 6'5" even without the worn hat on his head, his beard catching flecks of light, his shoulders filling the frame of the world behind him. The giant cowboy said nothing. He didn't have to. The air changed around him, the men stiffened as if the temperature had dropped. Mara hung over the shaft, fingers slipping, gasping as dust rose around her. Jonah's eyes, dark, steady, dangerous, fixed on Harlan Pike, who still held the shovel raised like a weapon. "Move," Jonah said quietly, a rumble more than a voice, and the crowd shuffled back because even they knew that tone meant no negotiation. Harlan scoffed, trying to act big, gripping the shovel tighter. "Ain't your business, Creed." Jonah's jaw flexed once. "That girl goes over," he said, "and you'll pray to see daylight again before I'm done." 1 heartbeat. 2. Harlan's smirk faltered. Jonah stepped forward, boots thudding like slow thunder, and reached the shaft's edge with a calmness that looked carved from stone. He crouched, one hand gripping the wooden beam, the other reaching down toward Mara with controlled precision, not panic. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked, her fingers loosened. Jonah didn't wait. He caught her wrist with a grip that swallowed her hand completely, muscles in his forearm knotting as he hauled her upward with a grunt so powerful the watching men instinctively stepped back, as if they'd witnessed something they weren't meant to see. She rose slowly from the darkness until her boots found solid wood again, and she collapsed against him, breath hitching, dust streaking her face. Jonah turned toward the circle of men, shielding her with his massive frame as he set her gently behind him. "Anyone else?" he said, voice low but echoing off every rail and beam in that yard. "Touches her again." His eyes swept the crowd, pausing on Harlan until the man swallowed hard. "I drag you into the dark instead." The mine yard fell completely silent under the noon sun, and for the first time all day, Mara Hale felt air reach her lungs. The mine yard erupted into mutters and shifting boots the moment Jonah Creed stepped away from the shaft's lip, his massive frame still shielding Mara as she gasped unevenly, dust caking her lashes, her legs trembling so hard she could barely remain upright. But even as Jonah steadied her with a hand the size of a dinner plate, Harlan Pike snarled from behind the men, "She ain't off the hook. Company rules say she goes down or she don't eat. and he jabbed the shovel toward the shaft again, the crowd drawing in like vultures circling a carcass they feared losing. Jonah didn't flinch. He simply turned his head, slow as dawn, and the quiet warning in his eyes made 3 miners step back without being spoken to. But before he could lift Mara fully to her feet, the wooden beam supporting the shaft's edge groaned, cracking under her earlier weight, and in one awful lurch, the earth beneath them gave way, just enough that she slipped backward with a strangled cry, her boots sliding across splintered planks as the world tilted and the black tunnel yawned below her like an open throat waiting to swallow her forever. Jonah lunged, but the break sent him skidding a beat too late, and Mara dropped into the mine's mouth with a sharp scream that ricocheted down the dark. Without a second thought, Jonah tore off his coat, tossed his hat aside, seized a thick coil of rope from the ground, one miners used to lower lanterns, and looped it around his torso with practiced speed. The men shouted warnings, but he never heard them. He was already moving, bracing a boot against the support beam, and lowering himself into the shaft with one massive hand sliding down the rope and the other steadying his balance. Dust rose like a dying breath as he descended into the dark, the sunlight shrinking above him, until Mara's faint whimpers echoed somewhere below, guiding him deeper into the narrow tunnel where damp walls pressed in and old timbers groaned under shifting earth. "Mara," he called, voice thundering down the shaft. A muffled answer came, broken, terrified, impossibly small. Jonah's jaw tightened. He dropped the last 10 feet with a controlled fall, landing in the dim corridor where only a fading lantern hung on a nail, its weak circle of light barely outlining her figure sprawled across the grit, one ankle twisted awkwardly beneath her. She blinked up at him through shock, fat tears streaking the grime on her cheeks, her voice a trembling thread. I didn't mean to fall." Jonah crouched beside her, checking her ankle with gentle fingers, his touch steady despite the rumbling timber above. "Wasn't your fault," he said, tone low but warm, a voice that felt like something solid to hold on to in the suffocating dark. She winced as he lifted her leg slightly. "Not broken," he murmured, "but you're not walking out." She swallowed, shame flickering in her eyes. "I'm too heavy. You can't—" Jonah didn't let her finish. With a single fluid motion, he slid one massive arm beneath her knees, the other behind her back, lifting her as if she weighed no more than a sack of flour, his muscles tightening beneath his shirt as he rose to full height. Mara sucked in a breath, disbelief flooding her face. "Hold on," Jonah said simply, voice echoing down the tunnel. Above them, shouts echoed, men arguing, beams shifting, dust raining down in warning. Jonah adjusted his grip, anchoring the rope tight around his torso. "Look at me," he told her, and she did, wide-eyed. "Ain't nobody leaving you in the dark." Then, bracing himself, he began the brutal climb upward, each pull of the rope lifting both their bodies toward the shrinking circle of daylight overhead. Dust bit into his eyes, sweat dripped down his jaw. The rope burned across his shoulder, but Jonah climbed anyway, steadily, relentlessly, the giant cowboy dragging her back toward the light inch by inch until the mine mouth brightened around them and the faces above shrank from awe into fear. And when Jonah finally reached the top and hauled Mara onto solid ground, he didn't release her or look winded. He simply stood there beneath the full noon sun, breathing hard but unbroken, the rope falling loose around him as if dragging her from the depths had been his duty all along. The ridge welcomed them with cool pine shadow and a hush that felt like the world finally taking a breath. Jonah didn't stop moving once they reached the surface, with the miners backing away like a pack that had finally understood the size of the wolf before them. He simply shifted Mara's weight in his arms and strode out of the Brightwater yard without asking permission or giving anyone time to think of stopping him, his boots pounding across the dusty ground as if he were carrying something sacred instead of someone the town had mocked for years. Mara clung to his shirt instinctively, her breath sharp with pain every time her twisted ankle bumped against his hip, but Jonah only held her tighter, adjusting his grip so she wouldn't jolt as he crossed the yard and cut toward the pine ridge that rose behind the mining camp like a green wall against the harsh sun. She kept trying to speak, half-formed apologies tumbling out, tangled with shame. Yet each time Jonah answered with the same steady certainty. "You're fine. Just hold on." He walked until the shouts faded, until the dust and metal stink of the mine gave way to the cleaner scent of sap and mountain wind, until the ridge path opened into a small clearing where sunlight filtered through tall pines and the air felt softer, quiet enough that thunderous hearts could slow. Jonah lowered her gently onto a fallen log cushioned with dry moss, the shade dappling her dress with shifting light as she winced and pulled her skirt back from her swollen ankle. "Hurts?" he asked, dropping to one knee beside her and pulling the metal cap from his canteen. She nodded, cheeks red with more than pain. I'm sorry," she whispered, looking anywhere but his eyes. "You shouldn't. No one should have to drag someone like me out of—" Jonah stopped her with a look, his brows lowering in a way that wasn't anger, but something far heavier. "Don't say that," he said, voice low as the wind threading through pines. "Ain't a thing wrong with you being built how you're built." She opened her mouth, then shut it, hands trembling in her lap as Jonah uncorked the canteen and reached gently for her ankle. She flinched from the first touch, not because it hurt, but because she wasn't used to gentleness, especially not from a man like him. Broad shoulders, thick arms, a presence so large it felt like it pushed back the entire world. Jonah pressed the cool canteen against her ankle to reduce the swelling, his movements careful, deliberate, as if he'd spent his whole life handling fragile things instead of wrangling wild horses and hauling timber. Mara inhaled sharply at the cold contact, then exhaled as the pain dulled. For a moment they didn't speak. The breeze moved the branches overhead, birds called faintly, and sunlight flickered across Jonah's jaw as he focused on her injury with a calm she didn't understand. Finally she whispered, "They're right, you know. I'm no use to anyone. I slow everything down." Jonah sat back on his heel and looked at her fully, expression unreadable. "You think usefulness is measured in how fast someone walks?" She blinked. He continued, voice gentler than she expected from a man who could lift her without strain. "I've seen men built like oxen crumble when life pushed them. I've seen tiny women survive things that'd break a bull. Strength ain't shape. It's what stays when everything else tries to shove you into the dark." Her throat tightened at that, moisture gathering at the corners of her eyes before she could stop it. She wiped quickly, embarrassed. Jonah noticed but pretended not to, reaching instead into his saddlebag to pull out a strip of clean cloth. "This'll help," he murmured, wrapping her ankle carefully while sunlight warmed the clearing around them. She watched his hands, big and rough but impossibly gentle, and something inside her chest, something long buried under shame, shifted like a beam of light touching a place that had never known it. When he finished, Jonah stood, scanning the ridge below where distant dust rose, Harlan Pike and his men searching. "We can't stay long," he said, offering his arm to help her stand. She hesitated. "You don't have to keep helping me." Jonah looked down at her with a quiet seriousness that rooted her to the earth. "I dragged you out of that mine," he said, "not leaving you halfway to the dark again." And with that, he carefully gathered her into his arms once more, turning toward the deeper trail through the pines, toward safety, movement, and a chapter of daylight she'd never dared to imagine. Old wagon ruts stretched before them as Mara reached into her pocket, fingers brushing the broken token she feared to reveal. Jonah moved through the pines with a steady purpose, carrying Mara as if she weighed nothing more than a bundle of wool, his stride unbroken even as the ridge trail narrowed into a sloping path of roots and old wagon ruts, the world brightening into a long abandoned cart road where sunlight warmed the grass instead of beating down mercilessly like at the mine. Mara shifted slightly in his arms, trying not to cling too tightly, embarrassment tightening her breath with every footstep he took on her behalf, and after a few minutes she finally murmured, "You can set me down. I'll slow you less that way." Jonah didn't stop walking, didn't even glance down. "Your ankle says otherwise," she swallowed, cheeks flushing. I hate being a burden." At that, Jonah halted at the edge of the cart road, where a broken wooden wheel leaned half buried in weeds, lowering her gently onto a patch of sun-warmed grass. "A burden," he repeated quietly, as if tasting the word and finding it sour. "You're someone who got pushed. That's not the same thing." Mara turned her face away, blinking hard as shame pooled behind her ribs like something hot and aching. "It's not just today," she whispered. "People have always looked at me like that, like I'm too much, like everything I do takes extra. Her fingers trembled as she reached beneath her dress seam where a hidden pocket rested, pulling out a small wooden brooch carved in the shape of a sprig of wheat, except one side was snapped, the smooth wood splintered through the center. Jonah crouched beside her, his broad shadow falling across the grass in a protective arc. "What's that?" She hesitated, tracing the broken edge with her thumb. It used to be my mama's. She wore it every Sunday. Gave it to me when she passed last winter. Said it meant a good harvest was coming for me someday. Mara's voice cracked, and she shook her head fiercely as if trying to ward off the sting. Then someone called me a useless field. Said even the wheat breaking off meant I was meant for nothing. Jonah's jaw tightened, the muscles in his cheek pulsing once with a quiet, dangerous anger, not at her, but at every cruel mouth that had spoken over her life. "Who broke it?" he asked, though his tone already implied he'd tracked the man down. Mara swallowed. "Harlan, last week." He laughed while he did it. Jonah's eyes darkened like storm clouds rolling in over open prairie, but instead of rising to go hunt the man down, he reached out with surprising gentleness and held his palm up. "Let me see it." She hesitated, then placed the broken token into his hand, her breath hitching as his fingers closed around it, careful, respectful, as if he were holding something far more valuable than a chipped piece of wood. Jonah studied it for a long moment before saying softly, "Wheat don't break because it's weak. It breaks because it's been asked to carry too much wind for too long." Mara blinked, stunned by the simplicity and truth of it, tears streaking her dusty cheeks despite her best efforts to keep them from falling. Jonah stood, scanning the ridge behind them. The distant sound of angry voices drifting faintly through the trees, Harlan Pike's men searching, closing distance. "We need to move," he said, slipping the broken brooch into his shirt pocket like something that deserved a place close to his heartbeat. He didn't ask permission. He simply gathered her up again with that same effortless strength, making sure her injured ankle didn't jolt. As he started down the cart road toward thicker woods, Mara pressed her forehead briefly to his shoulder, her voice trembling. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Jonah walked a few more steps before answering, his tone rough but sincere. "Because someone needed to be first." And as the sunlight flickered over them through shifting leaves, Mara realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't hiding her face. She was being carried toward the future, not away from it. Jonah descended the cart road with long, steady strides, following its curve until the trees thinned and the land sloped into a gravel grade overlooking the valley, sunlight spilling across the open stretch like a warning flare. He stopped there, setting Mara gently upon a smooth rock just as the distant thud of hooves rolled through the stillness like muted thunder. Mara stiffened instantly, clutching her skirt as fear pooled cold behind her ribs. Jonah didn't have to look twice. He recognized the dust cloud rising along the lower trail, the glint of metal badges catching sunlight as 3 deputies and Harlan Pike himself rode hard toward the grade, their horses kicking stones down the slope. Jonah's posture shifted, shoulders widening, jaw tightening, his entire frame instinctively pulling between Mara and the oncoming riders as if his body were a wall built for moments exactly like this. "They found us," Mara whispered, fingers digging into the rock. Jonah didn't turn. "I know." He stepped forward, planting his boots in the middle of the narrow grade where men would have to ride through him to reach her. The deputies slowed to a trot, horses snorting and stamping as dust swirled around Jonah's legs. Harlan lifted himself in the saddle, grin-wide and venomous, waving a folded contract in the air like a captured flag. "Company rules," he called, his voice carrying across the grade. "Girl owes labor. Sheriff'll back it. You hand her over or you'll be charged with obstruction." Jonah didn't move, didn't blink, didn't drop his gaze from the men before him. He spoke only 2 words. Quiet, but edged with steel. "Not happening." Harlan snorted. "She can't pull her weight. She's a drain." Jonah took 1 slow step closer, enough that Harlan's horse sidestepped nervously. "She pulls her weight in ways you ain't got the decency to see." Harlan's grin soured into a snarl. He shook the contract again. "This says she's property of Brightwater Mining until she works off her debts." Jonah held out a hand. "Give it." Harlan laughed. "You think I'm just gonna—" Jonah didn't wait. In one lightning-fast motion for a man his size, he reached up, snatched the paper clean from Harlan's grip, and tore it straight down the middle with a sound so sharp it cracked the air like a gunshot. One deputy swore. Mara inhaled sharply, hand flying to her mouth. Harlan's face reddened, fury and humiliation twisting together until he resembled something meaner than a bully, something cornered. "You just made a mistake, Creed," he spat. "Sheriff won't stand for—" Jonah stepped forward again, towering enough that Harlan's horse retreated another pace. "Don't talk to me about mistakes. The only mistake you made was pushing someone weaker than you for fun." Harlan reached toward his belt as if thinking to draw, but one look from Jonah, one cold, steady, unblinking look, froze him to the saddle. "You'll move along now," Jonah said, voice low enough to vibrate the dust at his feet. "You try taking her, you're going to find out quick what it feels like to be the one shoved into dark." The deputies exchanged uneasy glances. None seemed eager to be first to test the giant cowboy's resolve. After a tense beat, Harlan jerked his reins harshly, turning his horse with a frustrated growl. "This ain't over." Jonah didn't bother replying. He watched them ride off, keeping himself between Mara and the fading dust trail until the last hoofbeat disappeared into the valley. Only then did he return to her, kneeling so she wouldn't have to lift her gaze far. Mara's voice trembled. "They won't stop." Jonah nodded once. "I know. Then why? Keep helping me." He met her eyes with a steady warmth that softened the hard angles of his face. "'Cause someone like you shouldn't have to stand alone against men like them." And as sunlight washed across the gravel grade, Mara felt, for the first time in years, that her fear had met something stronger. The warm scent of fresh bread drifted from the small frontier bakery as Jonah guided Mara toward its sunlit porch. Jonah guided Mara down the far side of the grade, keeping a steady hand at her back as they followed a winding path that skirted the valley until the land softened into the outskirts of Brightwater's tiny main street, where sunlight reflected off whitewashed walls and the scent of fresh bread drifted across the open air like a blessing sent on purpose. Mara limped beside him now, leaning on his arm but walking, determined despite the pain, as they approached the little frontier bakery tucked between a cooper's shop and a boarded-up dressmaker's. Its porch was washed in bright gold light, the floorboards warm beneath Jonah's boots as he helped Mara onto the bench beside the door. Her breath shaking from the effort of moving, but her eyes fixed on the woven baskets of round loaves cooling in the window. Jonah ducked inside without a word, the bell above the door jangling sharply before he returned moments later with a warm loaf wrapped in brown paper and steam curling through the folds like a promise of mercy. Mara stared at it, confused. "That's for me." Jonah sat beside her, tearing the bread cleanly down the middle with those broad hands, offering her the larger portion without hesitation. "You ain't eaten since before the mine," he said, "and a body can't heal on empty." She hesitated, shame flickering across her face. "People stare when I eat. They always have." Jonah lifted the bread a little higher, brows dipping in a quiet challenge. "Only ones staring now are the ones who never learned manners." Mara's lips trembled, but she reached for the bread, fingers brushing his for a brief electric moment before she pulled away and took a cautious bite. Warmth hit her tongue, soft and comforting in a way she hadn't tasted since her mother's kitchen, and the emotion of it, unexpected, disarming, brought tears to her eyes. She tried to blink them away, but Jonah noticed. He always noticed. "Ain't gotta hide them," he said softly, chewing his own piece with slow, thoughtful bites. "Tears ain't weakness." Mara wiped her cheek quickly. "I'm just not used to anyone being gentle." Jonah looked out toward the street for a long moment, watching people pass by without giving them or their stares any power. "World's rough enough," he murmured. "Don't see why a man shouldn't try to soften a little of it." A small laugh slipped from her, broken, surprised, real. She held the bread close, drawing slow breaths as sunlight warmed her shoulders. But peace didn't last long. Across the street, two miners stepped from the saloon, their eyes locking onto Mara with mocking recognition before they smirked at Jonah. "Careful, Creed," one called. "Company don't take kindly to you feedin' what they ain't finished usin'." Jonah didn't rise, didn't even shift, but something cold settled in his gaze, a warning in the shape of a man. The miners hesitated, shame flickering across their faces before they backed into the saloon again with awkward half-laughs. Mara lowered her head. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I keep causing trouble." Jonah turned fully toward her, resting his forearm on the bench behind her shoulders, not trapping, just shielding. "Trouble found you long before I did," he said. "I'm just keeping it from taking more." Mara swallowed, her fingers closing carefully around the bread, as if anchoring herself to something she still didn't fully believe she deserved. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why go this far?" Jonah didn't answer right away. He looked down the road where sunlight painted the dust gold, where the valley seemed quieter than before, as if listening. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady. "Because you needed someone to stay when everyone else walked away." Then he stood and offered his hand. "Come on, we need to get you somewhere safe before Pike tries something louder." Mara placed her hand in his, letting him pull her gently to her feet. And as they stepped off the bakery porch into the blaze of daylight, she realized that Jonah Creed wasn't just rescuing her. He was slowly, carefully, teaching her what it felt like to be treated as someone worth protecting. Jonah led Mara out of town along a back trail that wound between tall sagebrush and scattered cottonwoods, the sun high and bright, the sky stretching wide and blue above them, as if giving them room to breathe after the suffocating cruelty of Brightwater. They walked slowly at first, Mara leaning on Jonah's arm, determined not to be carried again unless absolutely necessary, until the path narrowed into a cliffside trail carved by wind and hooves over decades, overlooking the canyon below where a rope bridge swung between two rocky outcrops. Sunlight shimmered off the frayed hemp strands, the planks shifting gently in the breeze, creaking with a voice old enough to make the unprepared hesitate. Mara froze, her breath catching. "Jonah, I can't cross that." He stepped to the bridge edge, testing the tension with a firm pull that made the ropes groan in protest. "It'll hold," he said, scanning the planks, eyes narrowing at places where wood had warped or cracked. "Mostly." She stared at him in disbelief. "That's not reassuring." Jonah almost smiled. Almost. "Ain't meant to be. Just meant to be true." He turned back, offering his hand. "We need to cross before Pike circles the ridge. This bridge is the only way he can't ride across." Mara looked down at her ankle, then at the canyon's yawning drop, sunlight catching on the jagged stone far below. Her chest tightened, a familiar heaviness settling onto her breath like it always did whenever something required more courage than she had ever been allowed to believe she possessed. "I'll slow you down," she whispered. Jonah shook his head once, firm as an oath. "You ain't slowing me. You're coming with me." She hesitated, but placed her hand in his. Jonah stepped onto the bridge first, boards dipping beneath his weight, ropes shivering as if the structure itself were deciding whether it could bear someone built like a giant. With his other hand, he guided Mara forward, steadying her with a grip that anchored her to something safer than the world beneath them. The wind picked up as they reached the halfway point, sweeping across the canyon with a low humming whistle that made the rope sway and the planks shift beneath their boots. Mara's breath hitched, her steps stuttering as fear shot up her spine. Jonah, I can't." "Don't look down," he said gently, turning back just enough to meet her eyes. "Look at me." She did. And for a moment the world narrowed into just the space between his steady gaze and her trembling grip. "Good," he murmured. "Now take another step." She did. Then another, until a sharp snap cracked through the air, one of the planks behind her splitting clean through under the strain, tumbling into the canyon below. Mara gasped, stumbling forward instinctively. Jonah caught her waist before she fell, pulling her flush against his chest, steadying both their weights as the bridge swung violently. "Easy," he said, bracing his boots against the planks. "I got you." She nodded shakily, tears stinging her eyes from fear and something else, something like disbelief that anyone would hold her this tightly, this confidently, without seeing her as a burden. Jonah shifted his stance, guiding her forward again. Slower this time, but certain, his hand never leaving her waist. Each step seemed to teach her a new piece of courage, the canyon wind snatching away the shakiness in her breath as if stripping her of every cruel word she'd ever been fed. By the time they reached the far side, Mara's legs were wobbling uncontrollably, but she made it, on her own feet. Jonah helped her onto solid ground, his palm warm on her back. "You did that," he said quietly. Mara shook her head. "Only because you were there." Jonah's voice softened to something almost tender. "Everyone needs something to hold on to the first time they cross a place that scares them. What matters is you crossed." She looked back at the swaying bridge, sunlight glittering over the frayed ropes, and for the first time in her life, she felt stronger than the fear that once ruled her. Jonah watched her quietly, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly, before turning to lead her deeper into the canyon trail, where light painted the stones gold and safety felt close enough to touch. The whitewashed church shimmered on the hilltop, its steps glowing under open sunlight, as watchful eyes gathered in silence. Jonah guided Mara along the canyon path until the stone walls widened and the land opened into a quiet rise overlooking a small frontier church perched alone on a sun-splashed hill, its white boards bright beneath the afternoon light, its steps warm like polished bone. He brought her toward it because he knew crowds gathered there most afternoons, families, ranch hands, shopkeepers seeking shade. And if Harlan Pike was planning to twist the story, Jonah intended to reveal the truth in broad daylight where lies shriveled fast. As they approached, a dozen townsfolk lingered on the steps, talking idly until their eyes caught sight of Mara limping beside Jonah. Murmurs rippled instantly, the kind that carried judgment like a sour scent. Mara shrank instinctively, her shoulders pulling in, her hand tightening on Jonah's sleeve, but he only stepped closer, his presence forming a solid shield between her and the whispers. "Head up," he murmured, his voice low but sure. "Ain't no shame in surviving." But the crowd parted for all the wrong reasons. Harlan Pike stormed up the hill, dust flying from his boots, deputies flanking him as he shoved townsfolk aside. "There she is," he bellowed, pointing at Mara with theatrical disgust. "Thief, runaway labor, and the man who stole her from company property." He held aloft a stone the size of a fist, ready to make a scene as cruel as the Minyard had been. Gasps rose. Mara froze, breath thinning, her eyes went distant, as if she were already returning to that awful moment at the shaft's edge. Harlan drew his arm back to throw. The crowd tensed, some expecting impact, others turning away because cruelty was easier to watch when it wasn't your own hand doing it. But Jonah moved first. In one fluid motion, as natural as breathing, he stepped in front of Mara and lifted his hand, catching the thrown stone mid-air with a smack so sharp it echoed off the church boards. The crowd gasped as Jonah closed his fist around the stone, his jaw carved tight with controlled fury. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You hurt her again," he said evenly, "and this rock becomes your lesson instead of hers." Harlan's face flushed purple, but his deputies hesitated, clearly rethinking their allegiance now that Jonah had revealed just how far he was willing to go. Trying to seize the moment, Harlan shouted, "She's useless. She slows everyone down. She breaks." "Enough," Jonah cut in, turning slightly toward Mara. "Tell them." She shook her head instantly, panic sparking in her eyes, but Jonah dipped his chin, steady, encouraging, until her gaze met his. For a long breath, she couldn't speak. Then she reached trembling fingers toward Jonah's shirt pocket where he'd tucked the broken wheat brooch. He pulled it out gently and placed it in her palm. Mara's voice cracked as she lifted it high enough for the gathered crowd to see. "My mama gave me this," she said, her breath shaking. "And she pointed at Harlan, snapped it in half because he said even wheat breaks under my weight." The murmurs shifted, no longer sharp but shocked, ashamed. A few townsfolk dropped their eyes. Jonah stepped beside Mara, not touching her, but close enough that their shadows overlapped on the sunlit boards. "Strength ain't shape," he said to the crowd. "It's what's left after the world tries to break you." He held up the stone he'd caught, letting the weight of the moment sink into every witness. "And she's still standing." Mara's throat tightened at the words, not because they were loud, but because they were true in a way no one had ever spoken over her. The murmurs softened into something like respect. A rancher's wife nodded. An old man muttered, "Ain't right what Pike did." Jonah turned back to Harlan, who suddenly looked much smaller than he had minutes earlier. "This ends here," Jonah said quietly. Harlan blustered, stumbling over half-formed threats, but deputies pulled him back, unwilling to challenge Jonah after the public exposure. Mara exhaled shakily, her knees weak, but Jonah steadied her with a hand on her elbow as sunlight bathed them in a warm, approving glow. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the target of the crowd. She was the center of its awakening. And Jonah, he stood beside her like a circle of light she had finally stepped into. Jonah didn't wait for the crowd to settle or for Harlan Pike to gather whatever tattered shreds of authority he thought he still owned. With the brooch returned safely to Mara's pocket and the stone still in his fist, he guided her back down the hill in full daylight, walking the long path toward Brightwater's mining yard as if the sun itself had commissioned the moment. Mara's steps were uneven, her ankle throbbing with every shift of weight, but she didn't ask to stop, not with Jonah walking beside her like a man carrying the whole truth on his shoulders. Word traveled faster than hooves. By the time they reached the yard, miners were already gathering in clusters, exchanging uneasy glances as Jonah approached the very ground where they'd watched Mara be shoved, mocked, and nearly killed that morning. Harlan, red-faced and desperate, had arrived first and stood near the foreman's platform with his deputies flanking him, trying to regain control by blustering orders that no one seemed eager to obey. Jonah walked straight into the center of the yard, stopping where the dirt still held the faint imprint of Mara's fall. He didn't raise his voice, he simply let silence settle like dust before speaking. "You all were here," he said, scanning each face until even the boldest men looked away. "You saw what happened, you heard how she begged, and not a single one of you stopped it." A few men swallowed hard. One shifted his weight, eyes darting to Mara's swollen ankle. Jonah held up the stone, the same one he'd caught in front of the church steps. "Harlan tried to throw this at her again today," he said, "after pushing her into the shaft, after breaking her mama's brooch, after calling her names meant to make her feel small." Mara lowered her eyes, shame flickering, but Jonah stepped nearer so his frame shielded her from the yard's full stare. "But this ends right here," he growled, "because sunlight don't lie, and every one of you saw him do it." Harlan barked a bitter laugh. "You think anyone here's going to take her word over mine? She's nothing but—" "Finish that sentence," Jonah warned softly, "and you'll be picking your teeth out of the dirt." The yard went dead still. Jonah reached into Harlan's saddlebag, because Harlan had been too rattled to guard it, and pulled out a thick, weathered ledger. Its pages fluttered as Jonah flipped it open, revealing page after page of rigged debts, falsified hours, deductions no miner had ever heard explained. "This is how you trap folks," Jonah said, holding the book high. "You push them down, then claim they owe you more for the trouble." A low murmur ran through the crowd, anger this time, not cruelty. Men stepped forward, a few women too, arms crossed, faces hardening as they recognized handwriting on pages that had stolen meals from their own homes. Harlan lunged, trying to grab the ledger, but Jonah sidestepped him easily, one hand gripping the man's collar, lifting him half off his feet. Dust kicked up around them as Jonah dragged Harlan to the old ore scale in the center of the yard, the same one used for weighing wages at the end of each week. Jonah dropped him there like a sack of tarnished metal. "You want weight?" Jonah said, tossing the ledger onto Harlan's chest. "Let's weigh what you've done." The miners pressed closer now, crowding around not out of cruelty, but accountability. A gruff man from the night shift spoke first. "Your numbers never matched," he muttered. "Thought I was losing my head." A young woman nodded sharply. "You shorted my husband every month." Harlan sputtered. "You all owe me." "No," Jonah corrected. "You owe them." He looked at the deputies, who suddenly seemed very interested in not being on the wrong side of justice. Brightwater don't need a man like this running the yard. One deputy swallowed, then nodded. "We'll take him out of town. Sheriff will decide the rest." Harlan's face turned ashen as the men hauled him away, his protests thinning into pitiful sounds, swallowed by the yard he once controlled through fear. When silence finally sank back into the dust, Mara exhaled slowly, her shoulders trembling. Jonah stepped beside her, not touching, just close enough that she could feel his steadiness like warmth on her skin. "It's over," he murmured, but she shook her head softly. "No, Jonah, It's the first time anything's ever been over because someone stood beside me." And as the miners watched, no longer cruel, no longer blind, they saw not a giant cowboy and the girl they'd mocked, but the beginning of a judgment that had finally turned toward the light. The quiet meadow unfurled before them, wildflowers swaying in gentle daylight beside the half-framed cabin Jonah was building. Jonah led Mara away from the mining yard once the deputies hauled Harlan Pike out of Brightwater, walking with her along the river trail that wound past sunlit reeds and open pasture, until the land blossomed into a quiet meadow dotted with wildflowers and brushed by a warm afternoon wind, a place so gentle it almost didn't feel real compared to the cruelty she had survived. He had brought her here because he knew the world would try to rush her healing, but the meadow didn't ask anything of her. It simply offered space, light, and possibility. A half-framed homestead stood at the meadow's edge, its foundation beams already laid, fresh-cut pine stacked nearby. The beginnings of a porch stretching toward the field like an invitation. Jonah paused beside it, setting Mara carefully on a stump smoothed by his worked hands, her injured ankle wrapped neatly in the cloth he'd brought from his saddlebag. She looked at the rising structure in surprise. "You're building a home?" Jonah rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly self-conscious in a way she hadn't seen before. "Was going to build it for myself," he admitted. "Figured one day I'd stop drifting and put my boots somewhere for good." He picked up one of the beams, lifting it onto his shoulder as though it weighed nothing. "A man gets tired of sleeping under the sky when he ain't got to." Mara watched silently as he positioned the beam, aligning it with the corner post. The afternoon sun warmed the sweat on his brow, glinting off the muscles in his arms as he hammered the wood into place. When he finished, he straightened and looked at her, not with pity, not with obligation, but with a quiet, something she felt all the way down to her ribs. "You don't owe me anything, Mara," he said, the breeze tugging at his shirt and the wildflowers nodding gently in agreement. "But if you want, you can stay here a while, till your ankle's right, till you feel safe." Her breath hitched. "And after that?" Jonah hesitated, then picked up another beam but didn't lift it yet. He held it loosely, as if the next words needed both hands free. "After that," he said slowly, "you can stay longer. Or go. Or build something of your own next to mine. I ain't here to trap you. I'm here 'cause I want you to know you deserve a place that ain't dark." Mara felt her heart rise and fall like the wind through the meadow grass. "But what if I'm not enough?" Jonah stepped closer, setting the beam down with a soft thud, then crouched in front of her until they were eye level, the sun catching the gentle flecks in his dark beard. "You were enough the moment you pulled yourself out of that mine with me," he said. "Only folks who couldn't see your worth were the ones blind from their own cruelty." Her throat tightened, her hands trembled. "I've never had a home, just places where I slept till somebody pushed me out." Jonah reached behind her, grabbing a small wooden box he'd carried in his pack. He opened it to reveal the wheat brooch, now repaired, the break sanded and joined so seamlessly it looked whole again. "Fixed it last night while you slept," he murmured, placing it softly into her palm. "Your mama's hope deserved better than the hands that broke it." Tears welled in Mara's eyes, falling warm against her cheeks as the meadow wind lifted her hair. She clutched the brooch and whispered, "I don't know how to start over." Jonah rose, offering his hand, not demanding, simply inviting. "Start right here," he said, "right in the light." She took his hand, letting him help her stand on one good leg, her other supported by his firm steadiness. Together they faced the half-built cabin, sunlight painting their shadows long across the grass as if marking the place they both might belong. And in that quiet meadow, with the river whispering its ancient songs and the wildflowers swaying like witnesses, Mara understood that she wasn't stepping into someone else's story, she was finally stepping into her own. If you were in her place, would you stay and help build the home, or walk on to seek your own light elsewhere? If this story touched you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more frontier tales of mercy, courage, and hard-won belonging.